Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to everyone who's here. And I will tell you, it is 94 degrees and steamy here in New York City, and it's the perfect day to escape to the Catskills. Um, my own introduction to the Catskills, like Ari, I was there. I came to New York to go to graduate school too late. The heyday of the Catskills was over, though starting in the late 70s, I was invited up there frequently. One of my teachers at Columbia was the film critic Judith Crist of the Today Show and TV Guide and the New York Magazine. And she was one of my 800 surrogate Jewish mothers in the Naked City. And she and her husband had a home in the Catskills in the town of Woodstock, which we will get into. It was a geodesic dome that had been designed by Buckminster Fuller. And many was the weekend I spent up there, and that was it. And then years later, it was 2008, my book editor, Alfred A. Knopf, called and just said, I want you to write a book on the Catskills. And I said, Vicki, you've got it wrong. I'm not into bugs and trees. I'm a city boy. And she said, no, no, no. The Catskills are filled with eccentrics, and you're very good with them. So that's what brings me here today. And yes, I will get to the Borscht Belt, but the Catskills is a lot more than just the Borscht Belt. Ari will go to the next slide. We had a slight technical glitch in that you see the preview of the slide that's to come, but I hope it won't confuse you. It will only tantalize you. Basically, here's a view of the Catskills. Now, for such an influential area, I mean, the name alone conjures all sorts of images. But the Catskills really aren't that big. They're not that tall. They're only 4,000 feet at their highest. The acreage is only 700,000. And its actual location is 140 miles north of my apartment. Or if you want to hop in a car, it's about 2.5 hours from here. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the first person to really discover and make note of the Catskills wasn't looking for the Catskills at all. He had no idea they existed. It was the Englishman sailing for the Dutch East India Company, Henry Hudson. And in September of 1609, he was looking for the Northwest Passage to Asia because it took a year for ships to go from Europe to India to get spices and bring them back. They were trying everything to cut the time. He sailed to what is now New York Harbor and went up what was then called the North River. We now call it the Hudson River. And as he went, he docked at this one port. He was greeted by both Mohicans and members of the Algonquin tribe at another spot. But up in the distance, as recorded by his first mate, there were these purple mountains. And those were the Catskills. And so he docked and left, continuing on the way to India, but he only got as far as Albany because that was the end of the line, and turned around. But this time, sailing back home, he didn't see the Catskills because there was dense fog that day. So it was left for others to go on and discover the Catskills. We'll go to the next slide. What got the Catskills going started in 1823. The state government of New York wanted the area developed and contacted real estate developers to put up what was, in fact, the very first mountain house for its time, the grandest hotel in the world, first in America. Again, 1823. New York City didn't have a hotel until 1820. There was no such thing as travel. There was certain, if a businessman had to get from Boston to New York, say, he either rode a horse or took a carriage and stopped at taverns where there might be a back room. He would have to share a bed with other guys. So this was something grand and unique. And it was only for rich people, because getting there was an adventure. You didn't go for the weekend. You went for either the month or the season with your servants, and you were fed up there, and it was very grand. It also set the tone for, you know, people say the Catskills and they think, aha, Jews, wrong. The Catskill Mountain House set the precedent, and all the hotels that were to follow for the entire 19th century followed the formula: mandatory church services on Sunday. And that effectively kept out Jews. We'll go to the next slide. Now that I have endeared you to the Catskill Mountain House, getting there, as I said, was an adventure. There was a stagecoach company owned by the Beach family. And in 1839, Charles Beach took over the Catskill Mountain House and continued to own it. And it stayed in his family, although he died in 1902. But the stagecoach, Dramamine hadn't been invented yet. And getting there was arduous, and people would get motion sick. And most of all, there was competition. Other grand hotels were being built up there, again, with this restricted policy. So what Beach did, he put in a cog railroad that was part of, again, the adventure. And here's what the Catskill Mountain House offered besides splendid service and eventually indoor plumbing, was this great ride up the mountain. Next slide, please. And once you got there, you did something new for vacationers. You had rugged outdoor activities. I mean, if you went to Sarasota, say, to the spa, you sat on a porch and you gossiped. Here, you climbed rocks, you went outside, you hiked. You made sure your nannies made sure your kids didn't fall off the mountain. But this was a natural rock formation, which was called Alligator Rock. It was one of the sights to see up there. There was also Catskill Falls. All of these things still exist. The Catskill Mountain House does not. Eventually, it went to the state in the 1960s, and the state burned it down, claiming that the area should just remain natural. All that remains today, if you run past it, is a gate post. Let's go to the next slide. But while the Catskill Mountain House was in its heyday, all sorts of publicity was being generated about the Catskills and creating great curiosity amongst not only the American public, but the British public and European public as well. And one of the chief perpetrators of publicizing the Catskills was our first short story writer in America, Washington Irving. Now, despite the name of Irving and the fact that he came from a family of merchants and his parents wanted him to become a lawyer, he was not Jewish, but he was great at self-promotion. And when he was a sickly child, the youngest of many children, and sort of the favorite. He grew up to be a real dandy. But when he was young, the family sent him to family friends to stay in Tarrytown, which is on the way to the Catskills. And while he was there, he heard all these various stories, including one based in the next town of Sleepy Hollow about a headless horseman. But his most famous story took place in the Catskills. And it was about this henpecked husband named Rip Van Winkle, Dutch, who, to escape his wife, took his trusty hound and his hunting rifle and took off. And he encountered the ghosts of Henry Hudson's ship. And they were playing a game of 9 pins, which is like bowling. And it was the legend held that all the noise from the bowling created the unbelievably loud thunder that still characterizes the weather in the Catskills. They also, the ghosts asked Rip if he wanted a drink, and he was never one to say no. So he drank, got drunk, and fell asleep for 20 years. When he woke up, the wife who henpecked him was dead. And everyone thought he was crazy because he kept asking about King George, and they said, no, now it's President George. Anyway, this story took off like crazy and made people want to see where Rip Van Winkle lived, made the Catskills more popular, And it was performed as one-man shows, stage plays, and even early silent movies. Next slide, please. So to cash in on this Rip Van Winkle craze, someone built on the road to the hotels, so tourists had to pass it. The first tourist trap in America. This is the Rip Van Winkle house, where Rip's rifle was on display, his jug, his rocking chair. Never mind that there really never was a Rip Van Winkle. People bought it, and they bought souvenirs, and then they continued on their way. Next slide, please. Further publicizing the Catskills was the Star Wars of its time, which was the Leather Stocking Tales by James Fenimore Cooper. Washington Irving was a delightful writer, very light and upbeat. James Fenimore Cooper was very heavy going, and yet his books caught fire. The most famous was The Last of the Mohicans. But they were like Star Wars in that he introduced them. They were all about this rugged guy fighting, raised by Native Americans, fighting in the Catskills. You know, growing up in Los Angeles as I did, I always thought Last of the Mohicans, it had to be about the Old West. Well, the Old West was in fact the Catskills because it was west of New York. And that was America's frontier at the time. So boys all over America read these stories. And again, this contributed to the interest and the desire to go to the Catskills. Next slide, please. We also have not only literature, but art that made the Catskills famous. It was the Hudson River School, a name that developed later. At the time, it wasn't called that. The father of the Hudson River School is considered Thomas Cole, and he was very young. He'd come from England. He'd heard about the Catskill Mountain House. He went to the Catskills. He did up 3 paintings that went to a gallery right near my apartment, although the gallery's no longer there, but the cross streets are, Wall Street and Broadway. And one of the great influencers of his time bought the 3 and then wanted to meet Thomas Cole and introduced him to all the important people of his era. And it was a time when arts and literature combined. There were social clubs. Next slide, please. And here is Thomas Cole's depiction from The Last of the Mohicans. And it's typical of the Hudson River School. Bright colors, rugged landscape. It was all about the beauty of nature and the glory that God bestowed on the planet. And this is as good an example as any. There are many famous examples of Thomas Cole. He fell out of favor for a long time, but in sort of starting mid-century, last century, he was in favor again. And they're unaffordable at this point. The Walton heiress bought the cover of my book. No, I bought the painting used on the cover of Kindred Spirits, which depicts Thomas Cole with William Cullen Bryan, newspaper editor, in the Catskills. And she bought it for something like $250 million from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and moved it to her museum in Arkansas. Next slide, please. So the legacy of the Catskills continues, but was established early on with art and literature. And those were also the first examples of art and literature. James Fenimore Cooper was considered our first novelist. Now, getting there was always a problem because if you were sailing from New York, which is where most of the visitors came from, you had to rely on skiffs, which meant the wind had to be there, the currents had to be there. Then along comes Robert Fulton, who invents the steamboat. And that takes all the, it was financed by a rich guy named Robert Livingston. And the two of them not only held a monopoly on all steamships on the Hudson River, but throughout America, and including those going down the Mississippi. So they kept the prices high. Along comes Commodore Vanderbilt, and Anderson Cooper's great grandfather, and he broke the monopoly, and the prices came down. and took over the steamships, which ran until the late 40s. But it enabled others, not just the rich, to go there, including, you know, young women looking for wealthy husbands, as well as gigolos looking for daughters of wealthy men. And it started to change the makeup of the Catskills. Next slide, please. Although one thing held true, these boarding houses that started going up there, and rooming houses and fancy hotels and just regular hotels, had a strict no Jews policy. We were not welcome, period. Next slide, please. And this was a typical, this is a typical boarding house, which has an interesting history because Flagler House, Henry Flagler developed Miami Beach and Palm Beach, and which were ritzy places. But this Flagler had no relation to him. This Flagler was what they called a leather tanner, which was one of the few industries that was ever in the Catskills. The other was bluestone excavation, and bluestone paved the cities of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. We still have some Catskills bluestone in New York City near the Plaza Hotel, in Grand Army Plaza, where there's a gold statue. Anyway, this Flagler tanned leather. Tanning leather meant you took the very stiff leather hides that were imported from South America, and you treated them with elm bark and other chemicals, and you strip the forest and you pollute the rivers. And his daughter ran a rooming house, and she kept out Jews. And then things started to change. I'll explain what happened. It was really a revolution. And she ended up selling the place to two Jewish traveling salesmen, and she got out. Next slide, please. I call them slides. I don't know what they are. This is a PowerPoint. If I were really sophisticated, I would know how to show you videos. Anyway, what happened was around 1900, there was a pandemic worldwide, tuberculosis, and nobody knew how to deal with it. Doctors in New York would send their patients down south thinking that the warm weather would cure their patients. The warm weather killed their patients. So then rumors started to fly out of Switzerland that crisp, cool mountain air improved the lungs, and in some cases cured tuberculosis. I mean, Washington Irving died of tuberculosis. It was everywhere. If you go to Washington Irving's house in Tarrytown, there are no beds. They're just sort of sofas because people slept sitting up. It was believed you wouldn't get tuberculosis if you slept sitting up. But of course, in New York, on the Lower East Side, there were these tenements with no windows and no drafts. There was no fresh air. Anyway, the Swiss cure for mountain air traveled to the Adirondacks, where a sanatorium was opened as an experiment, and it worked. So the doctors there said, why don't we try to see if the Catskills air will work, because it's that much closer to New York City. And the Loomis Sanatorium, Loomis was a researcher doctor from Bellevue Hospital in New York City. He opened it opened in 1901. People started flocking there, and it was believed tuberculosis was genetic. They didn't know it was contagious. So the same rich people who were going to their estates or their fancy hotels in the Catskills were riding in the same train cars as the consumptives who were coughing all over them. And suddenly when word got out that it was contagious, the hotels emptied out. If the rich people couldn't sell their estates, they abandoned them. And real estate prices plummeted. And guess who moved in? Next slide, please. By the way, obviously we're going to I'm going to take questions at the end of this. But if there's anything egregious that I say, go ahead and put it in chat. We'll deal with it. Anyway, so the Jews moved in, and this was the first. And in its way, it was like the promised land, because New York City in summer before air conditioning, you don't want it. And there were cheap places to stay up there. And if you could swing it, your wife and kids would stay the entire summer, and while the husbands would only go up on weekends, and they could take the train. And it became a Jewish haven. Next slide, please. And starting with very simple accommodations. They were called bungalow colonies. And I mean, these are sophisticated versions, but they'd really just be nothing more than wooden cabins. There would be showers, at one end. There, the toilets in another wooden shed. And it was said you had to bring everything from home: bedding, food. There was a common shared kitchen. The only thing that was free was the ice you could take out of the lake. But these were very popular, and summer after summer, the same groups and families would go to the same bungalow colonies. Next slide, please. Anyway, this idea of going to the Catskills really grew in popularity and became easier to get there when the George Washington Bridge out of Manhattan opened in 1939. And you then just went up, what is Route 17. And if you had a lease for a bungalow colony, generally it started at 6 o'clock in the morning. So you would leave you'd pack up your car and you would leave your apartment in New York or Brooklyn at 3 in the morning to make sure you didn't miss a minute of your lease for the summer. Next slide, please. And then after World War II, something really new happened. For the first time ever, Jews were wealthy in America. There was a Jewish middle class. They had money to travel, see America, but these restrictive rules were still in effect. Not every hotel would take Jews, and hotel managers would write one another if you made a reservation and your last name sounded suspiciously Jewish. So these Catskill boarding houses expanded, and Jews were also kept out of country clubs in America. So what you had in the Catskills were not only Grossinger's Hotel, but it was Grossinger's Hotel and Country Club, the Concord Hotel and Country Club, the Kutcher's Hotel and Country Club. Next slide, please. Whoop. And this is sort of the intermediary version of Grossinger's. It was just a simple boarding house. And the family came over, first the father. He was a ne'er-do-well, wanted to make good in America and would send for his wife and 2 daughters later. And he was here for 3 years. He never really made good. And he wanted to be a tailor, and then he opened a restaurant. Once his daughter was very charismatic and she could remember everyone's name, and his wife was a good cook, so they opened this restaurant. But then he started coughing. So he went away for the weekend and came back and told the family, I have great news. I've put $25 down. We're going to move to Connecticut. And his neighbors on the Lower East Side said, Connecticut's not the place. Go to the Catskills. It's like the old country. And he said, great, I'll open a farm. And they said, you can't farm up there because the soil is all, for one piece of soil, there are 2 rocks. What people do up there, you can raise chickens and cows can graze. You can serve butter and eggs and feed people. And you open a boarding house, and he wouldn't do it. And Selig Grossinger and his wife and daughter Jenny were out painting the mailbox one morning, and this woman came by, and she was Mrs. Brown from the Bronx. She'd originally come from Romania, and she said, listen, we're staying in this horrible boarding house. Could we stay with you? And uh, Mrs. Grossinger said, yeah, you know, move in. And that was the start of it. Jenny said to Mrs. Brown, why did you ask my mother that? And Mrs. Brown said, well, I saw her scheitel, which is the wig. And Jenny's mother had promised her father when she left the old country that she would never abandon her old world ways. And it would, you know, it was like a good luck charm. Next slide, please, because Grossinger's became like the Hilton of the not only the Catskills, but was an exemplar for hotels around the world. Jenny had to leave school when she was 9 years old. She only went as far as the 4th grade. Her girlfriends went to work at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. She saw them laid out after the fire. She was remarkable. And she just kept building. Her husband managed things behind the scenes, but she was a charmer. She remembered everyone's name, you know, and again, I cannot stress that 4th grade education. She later learned every language she could. She had private tutors. She learned that people dressed for dinner in nice hotels. Starting at the top, that's Jenny on the far left. In front of her is Bess Meyerson, who was Miss America and a television personality. And that's the Grossinger's dining room. And as you can see, it's black tie for men. On the right at the top were 2 honeymooners. And people don't really know them anymore, but they're Debbie Reynolds and Eddie Fisher. Or as, if you don't know them, they're Princess Leia's parents. I lecture live in person and people don't know who they are. And then below them, Eddie Fisher was a singer. Debbie Reynolds was America's sweetheart. They were married. And then he ran off with, that's Jenny with Elizabeth Taylor and Eddie Fisher in the middle. She was a Scarlet Woman who took Eddie Fisher away from America's sweetheart. Again, it was a scandal of the century in the late 50s. I'm too young to remember, but I remember my parents talking about it. So I feel it's part of American history, and Grossinger's played a big part of it. Below them is Paul Newman. He was a movie star with Rocky Marciano. He was a fighter, and Paul Newman played him in the movie Somebody Up There Likes Me, and they trained at Grossinger's. And then on the far left is Eleanor Roosevelt with Jenny Grossinger. And for a girl who only went as far as the 4th grade, I think that's pretty good. Next slide, please. I don't know why I get choked up when I talk about her, but I do. I just think it's a wonder. It's the American success story. And if you look on YouTube, it's not a very good print, but remember, if you remember, it's terrible not hearing your reactions. But there was an old show called You Bet Your, not You Bet Your Life, This Is Your Life. You Bet Your Life was Groucho Marx. This Is Your Life. And they did Jenny Grossinger. And she was not articulate. There was a woman in New York named Elaine Kaufman. She ran a restaurant called Elaine's where writers hung out. And Elaine was not articulate. And it's just in my mind that Jenny must have been like Elaine. Anyway, this is the empire Jenny Grossinger built. Look at that golf course. It had an indoor pool, an outdoor pool, a landing field for planes, a helicopter pad, its own gas station, its own dress shop. You never had to leave the property. It was the forerunner of Disney World, of cruise ships. It was remarkable. And when the gangsters built Las Vegas and their hotels, they modeled them after Grossinger's. Next slide, please. Grossinger's also played a large part in the mating habits of New Yorkers. Families would go up there and with their eligible children, daughters, and the head waiter would arrange the seating so that the particular waiter for that station was an eligible bachelor, likely going to medical school or law school. I recently spoke about this very presentation to a group of retired doctors from Bellevue. And one 90-year-old doctor said that he had been a waiter at Grossinger's and his tips paid his medical school tuition. And then he said, I don't know how you do that today, because how do you make $350,000? Anyway, that's now, this was then. It was considered the golden era. Leo Roston went up there and called Grossinger's Disneyland with knishes. And it was part of the American fabric. And you didn't have to be Jewish to go there. Next slide, please. Now, obviously, there were 1,000 hotels up there in the Catskills. We're talking right after World War II up until the early 60s, so throughout the 50s. But Grossinger was the Rolls Royce. The Cadillac was the Concorde. And they were great rivals. They were the Macy's and Gimbels, also terms nobody understands anymore, to one another. The owner of the Concorde, Arthur Winterick, was obsessed with Jenny. Whatever she did, he had to do twice as big. And he did. He hired Buster Crabbe, who was Tarzan of the movies, to be the lifeguard at the swimming pool. Milton Berle, who was the biggest star going on television at the time, opened the showroom when they remodeled the hotel. And Winterick hired the same architect who had done the Fontainebleau in Miami. And Milton Berle told the audience, you know, you think this new hotel is something? Next year, they're going to build an indoor mountain. Okay, next slide, please. I don't have his timing, but I did once interview. Yeah, I mean, and there were activities of all kinds up there, and they were year-round resorts, unlike the old days where it would only be open in season. This was Grossinger's. It looks like winter, and the women are getting tans. Also, you could ice skate outdoors, although the customers complained it was too cold, so they built an indoor ice rink, but it just wasn't any ice. They would dye it certain colors, and they actually had pink ice rinks up there. A little gauche, but fun. Next slide. They also had fantastic entertainment. I should add there was food, endless food. It was all about eating, and you changed your dress for every meal, and you didn't diet up there. Anyway, the showroom had everybody. They started up there, and if you look at it, I don't know if you've been to, no, you've certainly been to Las Vegas. You live in Southern California. It's a Vegas-style showroom. That's in the Nevele Hotel. And someone asked if that was Bob Hope up there. I really, the photo is not high res enough for me to tell, but Bob Hope did play up there. Everybody played up there. But what I like is the fact, remember, it's summer, and it's as hot in the Catskills. You know, if it's hot in New York, it's hot up there too. But look at the woman in the lower left corner of the image, the main image. She's wearing a fur stole, or as the head waiter called them, Jewish security blankets. Next slide, please. I know I'm not being politically correct. I'm just the messenger. So please don't be offended. And do you recognize these guys? These are some of the entertainers who started in the Catskills. Up in the top left corner is someone who turned 95 yesterday. That's Mel Brooks. He started really young up there. He was something like 16 years old, and he was what they called a tumler, who would just make sure everybody was having a good time. And, you know, it's why he's so rapid fire and so funny and quick on his feet. Although I interviewed him for the book. I've interviewed him a lot. He said that once when he was doing his routine, from the back of the audience, he heard a woman say, "Oi, English." Yiddish was spoken up there. Next is Jerry Lewis, whose parents entertained at Brown's Hotel, and Jerry was basically raised by Mrs. Brown. Next to him is Milton. The large photo with the large ego is Milton Berle. He was known for large things. Below him is Sid Caesar, who started not as a comic up there, but as a trombone player. Yeah, trombone, a musician. And he married the daughter of one of the owners of the Sheldrake Hotel, the owner. and Henny Youngman, you know, take my wife, please. And, you know, they told these jokes. They were not mostly a lot of mother-in-law jokes, a lot of jokes about how awful it is to be married. Tony Fields in the middle. She made jokes about her weight. She said, I went on a diet for 12 days and all I lost was 12 days. And then Danny Kaye, who sang and danced and told jokes and quick pitter-patter songs that his wife wrote for him. And those were just many of the names that then went on to the Ed Sullivan Show, which people don't know anymore either, I've discovered as I go out lecturing. But it was a pipeline, and the material was tested out up there. And it, you know, the audiences were tough. They prided themselves on the big names they would walk out of because they didn't find them entertaining enough. Or they would brag that I saw this girl singer named Barbara Streisand before she did Funny Girl. So part and parcel, and it was all included in your package for the weekend or the week or the month. Next slide, please. And these grand hotels had specialties. This was Kutcher's, where Ari went. It was known for being a sports mecca. If you played, that's where you went, like this guy getting out of his Studebaker in his fancy outfit. The bellhop, you may recognize, was Wilt Chamberlain, who was raised by Mrs. Kutcher, who said, I told him to drink his milk, and he did. And even if you had a room on the second floor, you could just open your window and Wilt could hand you your suitcase. Next slide, please. Now, I don't want you to think they were just Jews in the Catskills, although they were the predominant group. There were men who even were not necessarily gay, but liked to dress in women's clothing, which was illegal in New York State. Actually, a law that goes back to the Tenants' War in the Catskills. It's a long story. I have a book that goes long if you really want explanations on all these things. But Harvey Fierstein wrote a play called Casa Valentina based on Casa Susanna, which is where men could go and dress as women, have dinner parties together and whatnot. The first Black resort in America was owned by a one-legged tap dancer named Peg Leg Bates, who supposedly held the record for being on the Ed Sullivan Show more than anybody. And he was a charming man. One of my friends, her mother used to go up there and she just loved Peg Leg. She said all the women did, and he loved being kissed by all of us. And the New York Times, when he opened his place, the New York Times asked him, you know, how is it up there? And he said, well, it was a little rocky at the beginning, but now everything is kosher. Right below Peg Legs, there were the Irish Catskills, which still exist. Smaller than the Jewish Catskills ever were, but there are definitely pubs up there still going strong. And there are the Italian Catskills, and there are the Greek Catskills, and there were the German Catskills. Every group had its own pocket. Next slide, please. And among the groups were gangsters, because it was the perfect place to hide out. There were rocks and crevices and caverns where you could dispose of money or bodies. Legs Diamond lived up there. He was involved in a shootout in his nightclub in Manhattan, and his brother lived in the town of Accra because he had tuberculosis. And Legs was like a Robin Hood. At Thanksgiving, he handed out food baskets to families up there, and he equipped the restaurants up there with a fire hose and pumped in beer. This is during Prohibition. Of course, if he didn't like you, he killed you. But, you know, that comes with knowing a gangster. The most famous gangster up there was Dutch Schultz. He was also really the most violent. He was shot up, like the scene in The Godfather in the Italian restaurant. Dutch Schultz was shot up in a restaurant in Newark, and he was dying in the Newark hospital. And as he was running a fever, he started blabbing about his leaving $50 million in the Catskills. And there was a treasure map. And to this day, people go up there looking for The Lost Treasure of Dutch Schultz. Either somebody's already found it and didn't claim it to the IRS, or it still hasn't been found. If you want to join me, I'm happy to pick up a shovel. Next slide, please. Whoop. You probably recognize this. This is from the movie Dirty Dancing, which was supposed to depict the Catskills in 1963. So really Brown's, it was based on Brown's Hotel, where Jerry Lewis grew up. As I said, in 1963. The movie came out in 1986. Ironically, that's the year Grossinger's closed. Things had already started to fray. But things like this, Dirty Dancing, did happen up until the 60s. The women up there would often have affairs with the staff while their husbands were back in Manhattan working. I mean, it was a good time for all. Next slide, please. Well, if you're a fan of this show, you've seen that there are scenes in the Catskills. Now, again, as I've lectured on the book, some groups take offense and they don't think that the depiction in the series of the Catskills is accurate. From everything I can tell, it's really accurate and very entertaining. And I love the scene when the mother-in-law arrives and yells out to the staff, "We don't tip." Anyway, another slice of the Catskills that lives on, only on television. Next, please. So everyone wants to know, it was so wonderful up there. Why did it leave? Why did it evaporate? Its time had come and gone. There was a new generation. Kids didn't want to share these places with their parents. We could go to Europe and charge it. Air conditioning came in. There was a flight to the suburbs. You could have your own swimming pool. Women went to work, which meant there was no staying up there for the summer. The other thing that often gets overlooked is that Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill, and we mostly think of how it assisted African Americans. In fact, it was a big thing for Jews, because it meant that these hotels all over America that was keeping us out could no longer do that. So America was open, and so were the country clubs. And also the younger generation of owners of these hotels didn't want to work as hard as their parents. Next slide, please. We're up to 515 participants. Well, it's kind of like this next thing I'm going to talk about. Now, this guy sort of gave a boost to the Catskills in 1969. These fellows wanted to hold a music festival, and the town of Woodstock wouldn't let them. But they continued to call it the Woodstock Music Festival, and this guy donated his farm in Bethel, New York. Next slide, please. And what we had was proof that there was a brand new generation going to the Catskills. And this is Woodstock, of legend, of reality. And there is a concert hall on the site today, and they have wonderful acts, or at least they will again once COVID passes. Next slide, please. In the meantime, up until very recently, this was what the Grossingers Hotel looked like. It was never torn down. The property was bought. It was going to be redesigned to look like Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is a stupid idea. It had many owners. The thought being, we're going to get gambling in New York, in the state of New York, and we're going to, there'll be a big casino, and this will be a big draw. And we didn't get the gambling licenses until 2014, and by that time, there were casinos everywhere. Anyway, only recently, I don't know what the reason was, Grossinger's has finally been demolished. So this rubble is gone. When the book came out, which was 2015, and I was up there promoting it, I actually took a wrong turn one day, and I ended up in this driveway, and I said, my God, this is Grossinger's. And it was eerie. It looked like Chernobyl. and it was scary to look at the towers because the windows were open. They'd been open, this is 2015, since 1986. And the curtains, what was left of them, were blowing. I just imagine the wildlife and the bacteria and the mildew. Anyway, sad ending. Next slide, please. But remarkably, the Catskills have always reinvented themselves. And this is the charming town of Narrowsburg, which is art galleries, farm-to-table restaurants, breweries, bakeries, bed and breakfasts, you know, no grand hotel like there used to be. Kutcher's was the last one to close around 2015. But they all went. Next slide, please. But there are funky places to stay, like the Roxbury Motel, which has themed rooms. This is the underwater room. Those marshmallow looking things are meant to be white caps on the water. There is an I Dream of Jeannie suite in which you sleep in a bottle. And there's an Indiana Jones suite or room with bullwhips, whatever you're into. And they just expanded it and reopened. It's gotten tremendous coverage. And the Catskills are hot again and fun. Next slide, please. And as I said, there are things going on up there that does not say maple syrup. It says maple spirit. There are distilleries and breweries, craft distilleries and craft breweries. And I mean, these bottles are like $70 each. I'll stick to my Johnny Walker, but they're good. They're good. Next slide, please. And if you want, the Hamptons, if you're familiar with them, are overrun and overbuilt and overpriced. And the Catskills, land was cheaper. Things have changed since COVID. Prices are skyrocketing up there. But if you want, you can build a mansion. And this is an example. They used to be $4 million. I don't know what they are now. The prices are going up. But there are also the old bungalow colonies have been taken over and insulated and made nice. And younger families have moved into those and used them as weekend homes. Some were up there through the lockdown. Next slide, please. We're coming toward the end. What did finally happen on the side of the Concord was that this mega casino went up, Resorts World. And it is not a financial success. As we learned from Atlantic City, you know, you can gamble on your computer. You don't need to go to these places, and people are not. So I don't know what's going to happen to this place. Next slide, please. What has just opened after a delay of a year is an amusement park, which is of interest to me. I've not been here yet. Legoland's mostly for children. I think it will go because Legoland have international followings. And I think there's one near San Diego. Otherwise, there may be one in New England, I'm not sure. But this one opened in the Catskills, in the town of Goshen. And early reports are they're still working on it, so the customers are slightly disappointed. And it's mostly for young children. But I think it'll be a going concern. We will see. And the last slide, well, more or less the last slide, is simply a reminder that the Catskills are exactly what Henry Hudson saw, a nature's wonderland. And they're gorgeous. And they're available and accessible. And I invite you all to go. And that's the cover of my book. I invite you to buy it on Amazon or wherever. And I thank you. And now delighted to take questions. Wow, look at those people.
Yes, you have.
Hi, everybody.
I had to cut off the chat because people were chatting all about their adventures in the Catskills.
Of course, I know.
Let me open it up again.
When I lecture, I've lectured since the book came out, and I don't get so many questions as I get, you know,
stories.
What happened there. And one host of one of my lectures was very stern with the crowd and said, "Make it a question." So one said, "Did you know my Aunt Sadie met my Uncle Morris at Kutcher's?"
Well, I think we'll have to have a competition. So, okay, everybody, you're
Okay.
still on.
Let me hear about
This is
it.
what we're going to do. I'm going to invite people to send me their picture of themselves in the Catskills,
Ah,
and I will pick a few winners, and they'll get some prize that's related to the Catskills.
oh,
You know what? The winners will get a copy of your book
wow, good.
and maybe something from you and I will figure out what it will be. But what
Okay,
a
yeah.
great history! I did not know anything about the Catskills other than my one visit in
I
high
didn't
school,
know
which is
anything until I started researching the book.
so. Why did you? What made you write the book? I guess.
Well, you want the honest answer. My editor called and I said, "Vicky, you're crazy. Ask me to write about New York or London. I'm a city boy." And she's formidable, number one. And she is the associate publisher. Alfred A. Knopf is the best publishing house in the world. It's like if an actor got a call from MGM in the 1930s and they said, "You are going to be in a movie," the actor says yes. So I said, "Vicky, of course." And what happened was there's another name on the book under mine, Ray Silver. His wife, you may have heard of, wonderful woman and wonderful director. She died only recently. Joan Micklin Silver. She made Hester Street and Crossing Delancey, and she and I were old friends. But anyway, they were going to do a documentary on the Catskills. Only, it never happened. And they did a few interviews, and I got Vicky says, "You've got these transcripts," and I got them, and they weren't enough. So I started in 2007, I guess. The book didn't come out till 2015. I had a full-time job at Time Inc. But every weekend, every moment, I was researching the Catskills. And I did find it fascinating. And my favorite chapter is the one on the gangsters. And there were some colorful murders up there. And one of the guys escaped, and he went to Hollywood and became an extra. And he's in a fight scene in the crowd in the movie Golden Boy with Barbara Stanwyck and William Holden, and the cops saw him. So they hauled him back to the Catskills, but by the time they put him on trial, all the witnesses were dead. Anyway, nothing but, so that's why I did it, for the colorful characters, and Knopf did a beautiful job. The production of the book is exquisite. I didn't know that was going to happen, and it turned out to be a happy experience.
People want to know the pictures you shared with us. Are they in the books if they get the copy?
A lot of them.
Yeah.
No, there are more in the book, and even better, in fact, in the book.
And okay, good.
These I have to just refresh my memory, which is fading, and so I can keep the pattern going.
You know what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the chat after the program when I do a follow-up share.
I saw some of them,
and I'm going to share with everybody because there's so much stuff in here. It's kind of funny.
Well, this surprises me because I just think of the Catskills as an Eastern phenomenon.
Well, most of our people, first of all, the audience you're talking to is national and international, and it may be heavily California, but most of our California people are not from California. So like I was watching Ada. So Ada is one of our board members.
Hi, Ada. You were smiling throughout.
Yes. And I don't know about Ada.
Appreciated that.
I'm wondering about Ada and some of the people who worked up at the Catskills. But Ada grew up on the East Coast, and I know I guess that she went up the Catskills. So, and some of I don't know what her interaction was with some of the bellhops and the people who worked up there, but she's blushing. So I don't know her stories. But I know that she grew up. I mean, my guess is so. No, many of the California people have strong roots in the East Coast and grew up maybe in New York, New Jersey. Know the Catskills. Did you? So I missed it. Did you or your family grow up going to the Catskills?
No, I'm a Southern California boy. My mother is from New York, but she never went there. She moved out to LA during the war, and I didn't. I moved to New York for graduate school, and I've never left. But I had Disneyland. I didn't know, or I went to Europe. And when I got here, the Catskills was sort of a joke. I knew about Catskills humor from the Ed Sullivan Show, and they were sort of groaners, and I'd roll my eyes. But then Jackie Mason did a show on Broadway, and we were all in stitches, and it was funny stuff, and it's still funny stuff. And now I regret the fact I never went there. But by the time I got here, it wasn't there.
Yeah, it is a time past. But I'm glad you did the book, and I'm glad you did this program because you were able to recapture. And I think for even the people who know the Catskills, I think you added a great backstory.
Well,
So a few questions that I'm trying to track and ask.
sure.
I think Howard Dragutsky, who's definitely one of our locals and strong connection, grew up in Brooklyn. I don't know how much time and where he spent in the Catskills. Maybe he can chat in, but he's been chatting up stuff. And whenever you get something a little bit incorrect, he corrects it. Don't worry.
No, I'm sure. I'm sure. I do get it incorrect. But I'm from Southern California. I don't even say Yom Kippur properly.
Right. So Howard said the summer camps, Jewish summer camps,
Yes, of course.
started up there.
And sorry, and they were very left wing. There were a lot of red diaper babies up in the Catskills, and their parents were communists. And Pete Seeger was up there. All that's in the book. I didn't have time to include it in the.
But so is that really the origin of the summer camps, the Jewish summer camps?
Yeah. Well, origin, yeah, probably. That's where they went. Getting kids out of the city was a big deal. You know, growing up in Southern California, we had backyards, but here there are no backyards. Here in New York City.
Yeah.
Off they went.
So people are putting in the different camps they went to.
Was a big deal.
Yeah. People are putting in the camps they went. So they went from we started with what hotels they went to. Now we're going to what
the
camps
Red Apple. I see the Red Apple
right.
Rest. That was the halfway point. And they had hot dogs. Not only did they have hot dogs, but the entertainers would be there and bragging about how they killed the night before and trying to top one another.
Did the Jews really stay? You mentioned the Irish Catskills and the Italian Catskills and the German Catskills and the Greek. Did the communities really stay separate, or would people cross to see? I mean, would the Jewish entertainers, for example, try to do their jokes in the Italian Catskills and vice versa?
No.
So people wouldn't come to hear a famous Jewish comedian.
They might. Yeah. And the food. The food was a big draw. I mean, and it was endless. I have one friend. She was 16 years old and lied about her age. She got a job clearing the table at Grossinger's, and she was told, you know, if the knife and fork are placed on the plate in a certain position, that means they're finished. And she said they were never in that position because they never stopped eating.
Was this the origin of the all-inclusive package? In other words, you described what was going on at Grossinger's and the Concord, where you would go and everything was included. Yeah. Did it start here, or was it adopted here and just made bigger here?
To the best of my knowledge, it was popularized here. It may have started in Europe with some hotels. I can't say.
And then again, what year? What was the pivot point where Jews were allowed to come up there and the Jews started to come up there?
By 1914, it was an exodus. But it was starting at the turn of the century with the opening of the sanatorium, the Loomis place. That was the turning point. And by 1914, Jews went to the Catskills.
We have, someone says a shout out for Jenny Grossinger's Jewish cookbook. So let's look that up. That
was offered on that ad I showed. And if you buy the honeymoon package, you get the cookbook too.
And
there was a time they marketed their rye bread, and the poster, they had various people, Native American chief, a little black kid. It said, you don't have to be Jewish to enjoy Grossinger's rye bread. That was the ad.
There were a few people who asked if you would say a few words about the Catskill Resort Museum and tell us about if you know anything about what's going on there. And
I know they're raising funds.
I guess that's what they want. So maybe you don't know. So
contribute, please do.
I'll try to find a link so people can learn about this museum, where it's going to be, how big it's going to be.
Yeah, Catskills Resorts Museum. I think it's
people are now fighting over they say it's Levy's rye bread, not Grossinger's.
I'm sorry. You're right.
This is a very knowledgeable crowd. I think.
I appreciate that.
These people know their.
To me, all Jews look alike. Yeah. No.
I'll have to cut that out now of this.
Yeah, I know.
Well, before we end, tell us about some of your other books. I think we're going to have you back to talk about them. So what else have you written that?
Well, the amusement park book is the most recent, and it actually covers 900 years, not 90. but 900 going back to Bartholomew Fair in England. And what happened with the Catskills, knock on wood, did well. So Vicky came back to me and said, do you want to do the Adirondacks? I said, no, enough with the mountains. She said, well, what do you like? And I knew that, my mother always said, didn't like Disneyland, but said, we had Coney Island. I knew there was Coney Island. I knew there was the 1893 World's Fair, but I wanted to know, where did it all happen and how did it all get to what now is? If you go to any of these places, you've got to be a member of the 1% because they cost a fortune. But how did they start? And that's what that book covers. I also wrote the biography of David Lean, who was I'll never meet anyone like him. He made Lawrence of Arabia, The Bridge on the River Kwai, Dr. Zhivago, A Passage to India, Brief Encounter, Oliver Twist, Summertime with Katharine Hepburn. She wrote the introduction to my book. So the book after that was the biography of Stanley Donen. I'm very impressed you knew how to say his name, who only died last year. He made the great musical, Singing in the Rain, Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, Funny Face, On the Town. And he made wonderful romantic movies with Cary Grant and Fred Astaire. And I got Audrey Hepburn to write that introduction. And then I wrote a book called Funny Ladies about the great women comedians of the 20th century. And that came out as an ebook. It came out originally, I think, in 1999. And then it came out as an ebook finally 2 years ago and did remarkably well. I'm delighted, but
wow. So, in other words, what you're saying is we can have a lot of programs with you coming up. We've enjoyed you so much.
Happy to do it.
So last few comments. People want to know, how do they get an autographed signed copy of this book? Is that something that is rare to get? So you have to get through CSP, or is that something we can
come to New York?
Come to New York. Okay.
Yeah.
Email me, and if you're a member or a high level donor of CSP,
had a book
we'll take
plate
care
or something.
Yeah.
I'm happy to do it. Really. I'm honored to do it. Thank you.
And then just remember, send me your stories, rated, I don't want the details, if you know what I mean, but send me your good stories of up in our pictures, actually, up at in the Catskills, and we'll maybe choose a few, highlight them, and you'll get a copy of the book and some other treats. And also know that we're doing something called CSP Stories. I've hired 2 journalists, and our CSP people have great stories, like just alone, some of the stories here are great stories. And we're going to choose a few each month, and the journalists will interview you and write your story to share with CSP. So think about your great stories, whether they're the Catskills or other places, and pitch me ideas. And if you're a CSP member, we will hook you up with a journalist, and they'll write up your story to share. There's some awesome ones. So with that, a lot to think about. Definitely getting the book. Thank you, everybody, for being with us today. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you.
To,
I want to thank Joanne.
15 people. And Joanne.
I want to thank Joanne. I don't know if Joanne's even in here. I can't see her.
You better be.
Let's see if Joanne is here so we can say hi. We have Harris and Jan Schultz, my neighbors, and they always get picked on because they're my neighbors here in Orange County, but they're both from New York. So now I'm sure they're going to come over and tell me stories about the Catskills. I have a feeling that they must.
I'm sorry, you'll hear about Uncle Morris and Aunt Sadie.
Yeah, no, we're going.
Let me know how they're doing.
We're going to hear, right? We're going to hear about, and they have great photo albums now. So I don't know if they had great photo albums back then. I don't know what they've got.
They used to sell these little plastic things you'd look through. They'd take a picture of you and it'd be like a color slide.
Right, and there's Joe. So Joe.
I'm here.
Hi.
I really enjoyed the talk. And do you ever go to the Mohonk Hotel and give this lecture?
I go to the Mohonk Mountain House in New Paltz, New York, which looks at the Catskills. And I lecture once a month, either on the amusement park book or the Catskills. And starting in the fall, I'm going to be talking about Funny Ladies.
Great. Well, thank you, Joe. Thank you for the intro. You were right. You were right.
The check is in the mail.
And Jeff Kaufman, I don't know if he knows anything about the Catskills. He knows about everything. So I'm sure he and Mary are kicked the Catskills. I don't know. But hey guys, you can go out now. So New Yorkers, Lindy said she worked at the Catskills. Get your CSP hat, go up to the Catskills, send me your photo, and I'll send you a book. I can't send out 100 books. The first people to send me something with the Catskills. You get a CSP hat in the Catskills, you get a book. So And I think that's it. I have to go do some other work. So Stephen, thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Anytime.
Great
Take
stuff.
care, everyone. Stay well.
OCCSP.net if you want to learn more about us. I'll email you a follow-up, and appreciate everybody being with us. And I certainly learned a lot, so hope you did as well. Take care, everybody. Good to see you.